Good morning, everybody. We have a new chapter of Farmer Boy that we're going to be reading today called Filling the Ice House. This should be chapter 6 for all of you. And we are going to be hearing about what happens in the winter time when the Wilder family have to prepare for the summer. So they're also preparing in the spring and summer for the winter by having specific crops that they store up, which we're going to hear about later on in the story. But they were really resourceful even in the winter time by saving the ice that they might need later on in the summer. So we'll find out what kind of things they have to use their ice for, and especially what this process is of getting this ice and storing it for the warmer months. So let's start chapter 6. Can you all turn in your books to chapter 6 if you have one, and if not, you'll just follow along in listening. For Farmer Boy right now, I'll continue just reading aloud because there's a lot of great pictures to accompany the reading that you won't be able to see if it's the text like I did for Princess and the Goblin. Also, just 1 minute. Need to send something to a parent. So chapter 6, Filling the Ice House. Now the weather was so cold that the snow was like sand underfoot. We had actually some powdery snow like this recently. A little water thrown into the air came down as tiny balls of ice. So you could throw up actual water and it comes down as ice. Even on the south side of the house at noon, the snow didn't soften. This was perfect weather for cutting ice, because when the blocks were lifted from the pond, no water would drip. It would instantly freeze. So in the last chapter, I think they said it was 40 degrees below zero. It's probably similar to that. So way colder than even our coldest day recently. And so they're going to cut ice in this weather, and it's actually perfect. The sun was rising, and all the eastern slopes of the snowdrifts were rosy in its light. When Almanzo snuggled under the fur robes between Father and Royal in the big bobsled, they set out to the pond on Trout River. The horses trotted briskly, shaking jingles from their belts. Their breath steamed from their nostrils, and the bobsled's runners squeaked on the hard snow. The cold air crinkled inside Almanzo's tingling nose, but every minute the sun shone more brightly, striking tiny glitters of red and green light from the snow, and all through the woods there were sparkles of sharp white lights in the icicles. It was a mile to the pond in the woods, and once Father got out to put his hands over the horses' noses. Their breaths had frozen over their nostrils, making it hard for them to breathe. Those poor horses. It's so cold that even the moisture from their mouths as they breathe starts to freeze over on their nostrils. Father's hands melted the frost, and they went on briskly. Now, French Joe and Lazy John were waiting on the pond when the bobsled drove up. French Joe and Lazy John, these are some guys that help out Father. They were Frenchmen who lived in little log houses in the woods. They had no farms. They hunted and trapped and fished. They sang and joked and danced. And they drank red wine instead of cider. When Father needed a hired man, they worked for him and he paid them with salt pork from the barrels down cellar. So these two men are from France, and they don't have a farm, but they make a living off of just helping people out like Father. So they're hired out like for the day to help him cut ice, and they get some food out of it. Now they stood on the snowy pond in their tall boots and plaid jackets and fur caps with fur earmuffs, and the frost of their breaths was on their long mustaches. Each had an axe on his shoulder, and they carried cross-cut saws. We're going to see what that looks like. Now, a cross-cut saw has a long, narrow blade with wooden handles at the two ends. Two men must pull it back and forth across the edge of whatever they want to saw in two. So probably some of you have seen, or maybe your parents even have, handheld saw where one person goes back and forth with that saw. This one had 2 handles so that 2 men would go back and forth with it. Maybe you've seen at least pictures of this before. But they could not saw ice that way because the ice was solid underfoot. So imagine what you were doing. Imagine like tug of war, where you're going back and forth and you are standing on ice. You would just slip. It had no edge to saw across also. So there wasn't a place for it to like catch. When Father saw them with this cross-cut saw, he laughed and called out, "You flipped that penny yet?" Everybody laughed but Almanzo. He didn't know the joke. So French Joe told him, once 2 Irishmen were sent out to saw ice with a cross-cut saw. They had never sawed ice before. They looked at the ice, and then they looked at the saw, till at last Pat took a penny out of his pocket, and he says he, "Now, Jamie, be fair, heads or tails, who goes below?" Then Almanzo laughed. To think of anyone going down into the dark, cold water under the ice to pull one end of the crosscut saw. It was funny that there were people who didn't know how to saw ice. So he thinks it's funny, but none of us would know this either. Now they can't use this crosscut saw because they're standing on this whole pond of ice. And the only way for that saw to work is for it to be on one side of it. So the person is saying, what if one person is down in the icy water holding the saw up like this and the other person's on top cutting? Got to flip the penny to see. And that's also relating to like the luck of the Irish. So that's why they're talking about with it being an Irishman. So actually, let me pull up a picture of that crosscut saw so you can see this better. There's unfortunately not one in the book. So it's like this, although I don't see one with the 2 handles. Oh, here's one with 2 handles. So with 2 handles, they'd go back and forth. Imagine someone being below the water on that side. So, but basically they can't saw the ice yet. They have to get it out of the water first to be able to use a saw. So he trudged with the others across the ice to the middle of the pond. A sharp wind blew there, driving wisps of snow before it. Above the deep water, the ice was smooth and dark, swept almost bare of snow. Almanzo watched while Joe and John chopped a big 3-cornered hole in it. They lifted out the broken pieces of ice and carried them away, leaving the hole full of open water. "She's about 20 inches thick," Lazy John said. "Then saw the ice 20 inches, said Father. So this is thick ice. 12 inches is a foot, so it's 8 inches more on top of that. This is really thick. Lazy Joe and French John knelt to the edge of the hole. They lowered their crosscut saws into the water and began to saw. So they had to get to a part where there wasn't any ice, and then they could start sawing. Nobody pulled the ends of the saws under the water. Now, side by side, they sawed 2 straight cracks through the ice 20 inches apart and 20 feet long. Then, with the axe, John broke the ice across. So the axe breaks it so that they can start cutting it into the little pieces, or pretty big pieces, actually. Then with the axe, John broke the ice across into a slab 20 inches wide, 20 inches thick, and 20 feet long. Rose a little and floated free. 20 feet long. Wow. So it's going to look kind of like these blocks of snow. So there's giant ice cubes, basically, and there they are with the saw. They're having very precise measurements. Now, Almanzo ran to the edge of the hole, watching the saw. Suddenly, right on the very edge, he slipped. He felt himself falling headlong into the dark water. His hands couldn't catch hold of anything. He knew he would sink and be drawn under the solid ice. That would be terrifying. Now, it's 40 below zero, and he falls into this frozen water, which you would think in an instant, that would That would freeze him to death probably very quickly. And what if he went under the ice so that he was trapped? The swift current would pull him under the ice where nobody could find him. He would drown, held down by the ice in the dark. That sounds so miserable. But French Joe grabbed him just in time. He heard a shout and felt a rough hand jerk him by one leg. He felt a terrific crash, and then he was lying on his stomach on the good, solid ice. Phew. So he was mid-fall, and French Joe caught him just in time. Father was coming, running. Father stood over him, big and terrible. "You ought to have the worst whipping of your life," Father said. Now that might seem pretty harsh because Almanzo didn't mean to fall. It was a total accident. But Father is thinking, you need to be disciplined so that you're scared enough to never do that again. You shouldn't have been anywhere close to the edge where you were going to fall. "Yes, Father," Almanzo whispered. He knew it. He knew he should have been more careful. A boy 9 years old is too big to do foolish things because he doesn't stop to think. That's a good point. It's important for us to stop and think through what we do before we act. And even though accidents happen, we can't be thoughtless. And so Almanzo could have died just because he wasn't thinking before he did something. Almanzo knew that, and he felt ashamed. He shrank up small inside his clothes and his legs shivered, afraid of the whipping. Father's whippings hurt. This is kind of like a spanking. But he knew he deserved to be whipped. The whip was on the bobsled. But I think he's going to be using the actual whip, but kind of much more lightly than he would for his animals. "I won't thrash you this time," Father decided, "but see to it you stay away from that edge." "Yes, Father," Almanzo whispered. He went away from the hole and did not go near it again. Father finished loading the bobsled. Then he spread the lap robes on top of the ice, and Almanzo rode on them with Father and Royal back to the ice house near the barns. Now the ice house was built of boards with wide cracks between. It was set high from the ground on wooden blocks and looked like a big cage. Only the floor and the roof were solid. On the floor was a huge mound of sawdust. Probably seen sawdust before. It is tiny, tiny bits like debris of wood. And it looks almost like a sand if you're just seeing like a pile of sawdust. Which Father had hauled from the lumber mill. So he took all this sawdust from the lumber mill. Lumber mills are where they chop up trees, and so it's these little bits of the trees. Now with a shovel, Father spread the sawdust 3 inches thick on the floor. On this, he laid the cubes of ice 3 inches apart. Then he drove back to the pond, and Almanzo went to work with Royal in the ice house. So the men are mainly the ones working on the ice, chopping it or sawing it into the cubes. And Royal and Almanzo are at the ice house. Let's see what they do. They filled every crack between the cubes with sawdust. They're 3 inches apart, and they've got a bunch of sawdust between them, and tamped it down tightly with sticks. Then they shoveled the whole mound of sawdust on top of the ice in a corner, and where it had been, they covered the floor with cubes of ice and packed them in sawdust. Then they covered it all with sawdust 3 inches thick. So they've got a layer of sawdust below, all of these cubes, sawdust goes between them and on top. They worked as fast as they could, but before they finished, Father came with another load of ice. So they're pretty fast, but the men are faster at cutting the ice. He laid down another layer of ice cubes 3 inches apart and drove away, leaving them to fill once again every crevice, every little nook and cranny tightly with sawdust. And they spread sawdust over the top and shoveled the rest of the mound of sawdust up again. Let me show you the sawdust, by the way. There it is. Like, here's this saw, and that's what's left. And here's sawdust over the ice. Nice. don't know if this is still being done, but the sawdust keeps it cold, as we'll see. Now, let's see. So they have more ice coming, more than they can keep up with. They worked so hard that the exercise actually kept Royal and Almanza warm. But long before noon, Almanza was hungrier than wolves. He couldn't stop work long enough to run into the house for a donut. Again, he loves those donuts. All of his middle was hollow, with a gnawing inside of it. He knelt on the ice, pushing sawdust into the cracks with his mittened hands, and pounding it down with a stick as fast as he could, and then he asked Royal, "What would you like best to eat?" They talked about spare ribs and turkey with dressing, baked beans, crackling cornbread, and other good things. But Almanza said that what he liked most in the world was fried apples and onions. That sounds good. Don't think of apples and onions going together very often, but I bet that's so tasty. When at last they went in to dinner, there on the table was a big dish of them. What luck, he gets his favorite thing. Mother knew what he liked best, and she had cooked it for him. That's really sweet. Almanza ate 4 large helpings of apples and onions fried together. He ate roast beef and brown gravy, mashed potatoes, creamed carrots, and boiled turnips, and countless slices of buttered bread with crabapple jelly. Yum. It takes a great deal to feed a growing boy, Mother said. So she is happy that he's eating a lot because he is growing and he's working so hard. She put a thick slice of bird's nest pudding on his bare plate and handed him the pitcher of sweetened cream speckled with nutmeg. Bird's nest pudding is actually, I've got this book here that has a recipe of it even. Basically, it's a bunch of apples. It's brown sugar baked in green apples. And so it's like an apple pie, sort of, but with the kind of green tart apples. And they call it bird's nest pudding. Now, Almanza poured the heavy cream over the apples and nested in the fluffy crust. The syrupy brown juice curled up around the edges of the cream. Almanza took up his spoon and ate every little bit. Then, until chore time, he and Royal worked in the ice house. All next day they worked, and all the next day. Just at dusk on the 3rd day, Father helped them spread the last layer of sawdust over the topmost cubes of ice in the peak of the ice house roof, and that job was done. Buried in sawdust, the blocks of ice would not melt in the hottest summer weather. One at a time, they could be dug out, and Mother would make ice cream and lemonade and cold eggnog. So it's going to be used for ice cream and lemonade and cold eggnog in the future. So it's good that they're using this ice so well. So here is, once again, a picture of what that kind of looks like. So here's blocks of ice, and they're compacted with this sawdust on the outside to keep it frozen. And in this case, there's even straw on top, but there wasn't straw in this book. They didn't mention straw, right? No, I don't think so. It was just the sawdust. But the sawdust keeps it cold. It's a natural insulator for it. Huge blocks of ice with sawdust around it. Okay, as the last part of this video, I want us to go through the steps of what it was like for them to fill the ice house. So would you all take out some paper from your binder, and we're going to write out the steps together. With this book, we'll be doing occasional writing assignments, and this one is going to be steps, like a how to pack an ice house full of snow. Okay, pause the video if you need more time to get your supplies, but let's go ahead and write the steps to filling an ice house. We'll write our name, date, We can actually write this in cursive. I should have done that to begin with. This is literature, chapter 6. Okay. And I'll title it Steps to Filling an Ice House. Okay. Now, the first step in filling an ice house is that they chop a triangle in the ice to check its thickness. Actually, let me check. Is that the right way to do the... Sorry, I forgot that it's actually crossing over for the T. My cursive is different than the kind that they use, so I forgot. Okay. They chop a triangle in the ice to check its thickness. By the way, for its thickness, we don't need an apostrophe. If we add an apostrophe, it's like it is. This one is like the ice's thickness. And the thickness is 20 inches. And the abbreviation for inches can be IN or the two like quotation marks. We'll go ahead and just write IN, but quotation marks also is an abbreviation. The second step, and I'm going to skip a line between the steps, is that they cut strips of ice 20 feet long by 20 inches wide. They cut strips of ice 20 feet long. We can also abbreviate feet with FT by 20 inches wide. I'll keep it as the full word when we're writing it in a sentence, but that was just an abbreviation on the side. Okay, step 3. They divide the strips into 20-inch blocks. So I have these long strips of wood, and then they divide it into the blocks. Step 4. They load the blocks on a sled, and where do they take them? And take them to the ice house. Actually, we'll say place them in the ice house. How far apart were they? Do you remember? 3 inches apart. I know I'm probably going faster than you since I'm faster with cursive. Just pause at any time if you need more time. And last step, they fill and pack every crevice, like every little tiny bit, where there's maybe a hole or a little nook where air could get in. They pack every crevice or crack with sawdust. Also covering the top. And then once they're done with all of these 5 steps, they would repeat over and over again until they've filled the entire ice house. So check the thickness, see how thick it is, and then they can see it's going to be 20 feet long, 20 inches wide, little strips. And then they make little blocks, little cubes, and they load those cubes into the sled where they place them 3 inches apart. And then they pack it filled with some sawdust. So there it is. The steps to filling an ice house. Now you know what you would have to do if you didn't have a freezer. You could use sawdust to insulate your things so that it would still stay cold. Okay, that is all for our reading today. You have a couple questions also on Bright Thinker to do when you're finished with that. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you on Monday. Bye.